Hey guys, what's up? Welcome to tonight's Blender live stream. My name is Brandon Hicks with the Orange Guild, and tonight is going to be fun. We are going to be taking a look at how to do some motion graphics, getting into 2.8, checking out the Eevee rendering engine, and just checking out some ways to do some cool animations and hopefully learn some new things along the way. So, if you get ready to join me, you can follow along. You can also pop into the chat, ask me questions along the way. Always here to help you guys out any way I can. So let's get started. Let me transition my screen over here. Okay, so I'm going to start tonight by talking a little bit about the process of getting things into Blender so that we can start animating some logos, things like that. And so this is a really cool method that will help you kind of speed the process up a little bit. If we take a look at 2.8 here, again, or 2.79 actually. In fact, let me just go ahead and open up 2.8 and do that there. Okay, so we got 2.8. And typically, if you wanted to sort of do motion graphics and start animating something custom, like a logo, you would have to find a way to import that and kind of work with that. And tonight, we're going to be talking about some ways to do that. So typically, you might go to import, and you might want to grab an SVG, something like that. And so if we pop over into, let's see, our streaming folders, let's grab our motion graphics, and this is the logo for the Orange Guild. So we import that, and it's going to load that into our scene. Should be in the center of our world there. And I'm not sure if the SVG importer is working correctly in 2.8 yet, but typically it should load right there. So here's a shortcut that will help out a little bit if 2.8 is kind of not working yet for you. So you can go to File, Import the same thing in 2.79, and then we're just going to go back into that same folder we were just in for the motion graphics, pull this in, and now you should see that come in right there. So it's going to be really, really small, and if you want to scale it up, just hit S, pull that up. Turn on my screencast keys here. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and recenter this around the center of the object and then reposition that in the middle of our world here. And so let's talk about some of the options we have to start off with. So you're going to see this come in as an SVG that is sort of an object with curves, and you'll be able to tell that by the little curve icon instead of the object data you typically see. Also, if you select this and tab into edit mode, you're going to see that you have the option to edit curves in Blender the same way you similarly would in Inkscape or in Illustrator. If you move those around, you can see kind of what that's doing there for those curves. So these behave a little bit differently than mesh objects. And what's cool about this is that you can convert to a mesh, you can keep it as a curve, you can play with it here with the extrude. So let me go ahead and add a separate material here. That is a little bit easier to see. Let's jump down into our settings, viewport color. Let's pull this up to maybe a gray. Okay, so with the curve settings here, we can go ahead and play with the extrude. We can also play with the depth, so we can add a little bit of a bevel there, as you can see. And all of these things are also available if we are using text. So if you want to do this with text, it's the same basic process. So what you can do is go ahead and let's jump to a new layer. Let's go ahead and add in a text object. And text is really cool if you haven't played with that in Blender. It's really fun to kind of see what's possible with motion graphics with this. So we could put something like the Orange Guild, tab back into object mode. And then once again, you can go into the properties for this object, which is a text object. This is a custom object in Blender, which will allow you to pick a font to use. It's going to default to the Blender font, but you can hit X here and then load up a font that is on your system. So in this case, I've actually created a custom font that actually holds my logo. And so before we get into that, let me go ahead and show you some of the options that are similar. So again, we got extrude. Go ahead and set that up. We've got the ability to offset. So you can kind of get a little skinnier or fatter. That's kind of interesting. And then of course we've got depth, which will add a little bit of that bevel there. Now you'll notice that it's kind of beveling with one sort of one cut here, the same way as with the bevel operator. So if you turn up the resolution, it will actually start to smooth that out with more curves on those edges. And that's how you get a smooth transition with that bevel. Okay, so again, this is really awesome because all of this is dynamic. So if you want to change the text at any point in time after you've already done a lot of stuff here, you can just go back in and edit on the fly. And of course, you've got the same type of properties that you would always have in a text editor. So you've got alignment, you can center it vertically on the baseline, top, center, bottom, things like that. And then you've got spacing for the letters, the words, lines, so you can animate all of these properties. And this is a quick way to kind of get started with some motion graphics in Blender. Okay, so let me show you something cool that will help you quickly move between 2.79 and 2.8. To do this, you're going to need to have an add-on enabled. So let me switch over to the add-ons menu here. And you're going to need to have this copy attributes checked off right here. So if we look at copy under the search, you're going to see you've got two of these available. One is copy settings, one is copy attributes. And copy attributes is the one you want to check off. What that's basically going to do is allow you to hit Control-C on your in your 3D viewport with something selected, and you can copy that to the buffer, which is going to basically put it on your clipboard for your system. And then what you can do, once you have that selected in your clipboard, is you can move over into 2.8 and just hit Control-V, and that will paste that right into your 3D viewport. So that's great because in the past few releases for 2.8, it's not always been possible to save or import objects. And so it looks like they've actually gone back and added in some extra imports now, so you can import OBJs and stuff. And before, there was only a couple of options in here. So if you ever want to move quickly between, just remember that little shortcut with the special copy, Control-C, copy to buffer, and then paste in here. Okay, so let's talk about one of the other options that I kind of developed tonight. And again, there could be different reasons for doing this, but it's cool to kind of see what your options are available to you when you're getting in here working on the motion graphics. So one of the things that you can do to kind of expand on the capabilities here is to use the font option as a tool in your arsenal to import custom fonts. And so what I've done is I've actually created my own custom font here for my brand. And so if I open that up, you can see that if I just get rid of everything here, the only thing actually, the only letter I actually have assigned in this is the capital O on the keyboard. And that will actually put my logo right here in the 3D viewport. So that's pretty cool because then I've got all those same options that were available to me in the curves option by importing that SVG in the font options. And so now if I wanted to incorporate this with some text right next to it, I might be able to, grab this and then say, okay, we could type some other things in here. We could look at the font options here. So we've loaded a custom font. This is the Orange Guild font under regular, but if we want to select italic and we want to select the normal fonts that you would have here, then all I have to do is type something in like the Orange Guild, and then what I could do is grab all of these objects here, these letters that are part of this, and then italicize them. And that should convert that over for us. Interesting. So it doesn't look like it will let us mix those hybrids. You could also duplicate the object and do it that way, which should work. But those are some interesting options that you can do there with these font properties. So the same basic settings are available to us here, as I just mentioned. So if we jump in here, we've got our depth, and then we've got our resolution, bring that up to 1, extrude, pull that down a little bit so that we've got sort of an object to work with. And now we've got something that at least we can start animating and working on some motion graphics with. So what we're going to do tonight is take a look at how we could get into Eevee and just kind of start playing with some of the options that are available. It's a little bit more stable now than it was before, and so I feel a little bit more comfortable sharing with you guys what some of this does. So I'm going to bring some of this down a little bit, and let's work a little bit more on this logo to make it a little bit more interesting. So I'm going to start by taking this logo here, jump into a top view. I'm going to go ahead and let's see if we can reposition this origin here. So we'll search for origin, set the origin to the 3D cursor, and then we're going to move that back to the center of our 3D world there. Okay. So what's cool now is that I can use all of these dynamic text options to kind of edit this and play with this a little bit and add some extra layers of detail to this. So if we go ahead and jump into the text properties, I'm going to jump back up here to the very top, and you can see that under this fill mode we have options for just front, and you can see the back is now sort of uncovered. You've got options for the back, which will do the opposite. You can do both, and then you've got none. And none will just basically create an outline of your object or your text. So with that selected, we can select both, or maybe none, and Shift-D to duplicate, and now we can select both to fill this one. So we've got two identical objects sitting on top of each other. Now this one, I'm going to take the bevel depth down to 0, and the resolution down to 0, because we're not going to bevel this one. But the other copy has been beveled, and so you can see we kind of have sort of an inset object here. And if we take the extrude down on the interior object a little bit, you can see that we've got a little bit of a lip here that is on the outside edge there. Now if you're getting some intersections that are kind of popping through on these edges, as you can see right here, grab one or both of those objects and play with the offset a little bit, and that's going to kind of control how those intersections play and interact, and you can distance those out a little bit more with creating a really, really small value right there. So that is a kind of interesting thing to just add a little bit of depth. And to see this a little bit better, let's go ahead and start playing with some materials and some lighting. So I'm going to split the window right here. Let's jump into our shader editor. I'm going to go ahead and create a new material. Okay, so we're going to be using completely PBR based stuff in tonight's video. So go over to the render engine, make sure instead of cycles you've got Eevee selected, and that's what we're going to be playing with. For the base color, I'm going to switch over into look dev instead of the solid view right here in the 3D viewport. And that's going to let us see some of these colors a little bit as we play with this. And so we might switch this into sort of a darker orange, burnt orange color. And then I can select this one, create another, and then this one might be a little bit more of a bright orange, as you can see there. So then we can start playing with these material attributes, decide whether they're metallic or we want to make them look plastic, how rough they are, and of course with the principled BSDF that we've had automatically added here with Eevee checked off, you can see all these attributes are very easy to play with. So what's great is if you switch into Eevee, you need to add some lighting to preview this, but it's all live. So let me go ahead and show you how we can start playing with this. So first thing I would do is go over into your world settings, and you can see that there. Click on use nodes, and then I'm going to take my background all the way to black. So we can start off with a clean slate and then just start playing with our lighting here. So I'm going to hit Alt-A to get rid of the selection, and I'm going to play a little bit with what overlays I have showing here because I don't want all of this stuff active. So we can turn off our gizmo that's right here. We don't need to have that cluttering up our viewport. Turn off the grid, turn off the X and Y axes, and that just cleans up a little bit of what we can see in here. So now we can go ahead and, if we can't see anything, but we want to be able to tell where we're at, switch back into look dev real quick. let's go ahead and add in some lights. So we can jump into lights and let's play with an area light. So I'm just going to rotate around, kind of approximate where this needs to be in our scene. And then once we have sort of an initial light here, we can jump into those light settings and start playing with that a little bit. So to preview what this looks like, switch back into the rendered view. You can see that's very, very bright, and it's also very, very close. So the further we move away from that object, the less intense that's going to be on the shader. Or you can also optionally turn down the energy right here until that is at an appropriate value for the distance to the object. So I'm going to recommend kind of backing this off a little bit. We might also want to increase the size so it's a little bit softer shadows, things like that. And let's go ahead and turn that energy back up and zoom in. So we just have our logo in view. We're going to select our light here and then turn that energy back up a little bit more. Now this is where we can start playing with the material attributes a little bit, because now we have a light in the scene. So what we may want to do is I could turn up the metallic slider here to kind of do a hybrid between a sort of dielectric material and a metallic material. What's really going to start making this pop is how rough this is. So if you want this to be really reflective, just turn this down and you're going to start getting a lot more interaction here with things in the scene. Now, right now, there's not a lot to reflect, so you got to be at the right angle to kind of see how that's working. This is reflecting the light that we just added. And so to make this a little bit easier, let's go back into the world settings and let's play with adding an HDR background. So I'm going to pull one in that I got from Blender Cloud, and it's called Blue Grotto if you guys are interested. And let's go ahead and do that in the shader editor here. So I'm going to select the world options for our shader. This is the same exact thing that you're tweaking over here. It's just a node form. And so now what we want to do is jump into our shaders, and let's go ahead and to texture, and I want to add an environment texture. So I'm going to load in from the HDR that I got from Blender Cloud. Open that up. Go ahead and hit Control-T to add in all of our mapping nodes, texture coordinate nodes using the Node Wrangler add-on. And now we can go ahead and plug this in to our color here. Okay, so as you rotate around in the 3D viewport, this is going to be just like any other PBR-based experience. You'll be able to see kind of what is going on interaction-wise. You're going to start seeing those reflections occur on the surface of your object. And of course, that's also contributing to your lighting. So if we go ahead and turn this intensity back down to 0, or maybe if we move this to a new collection, and we might just name this lights. You can see here, hit M, hit a new collection, type in lights here, then hit OK. And now you can see that in our object outliner over here, our scene outliner over here, we've got a lights collection. So if you're not familiar with collections yet, these are basically replacing the layers that used to be down here or up here in the 3D viewport. And so it's a much better way to kind of visualize in an organized way where everything is. And so you can still use your keys above the top part of your keyboard to turn these on and off. So if I hit 1, it's going to turn everything off except for the first collection. We could call this objects. And then 2 would be the lights, and so on and so forth. Hit 3, 4, 5, 6, whatever. But right now I only have 2 objects. So the first one's going to be the objects collection. The second one's going to be the lights collection. And if I hit Shift and 1 and Shift and 2, I can turn these on and off together as both are selected. You can also control that here manually if you want to. And so now what we can do is just to preview what this is going to look like with our HDR lighting. Let's turn off the collection visibility for our lights here. So I don't want to be seeing what that's doing. And so now, if I play with the strength of our HDR in the background, you can see we can get all the way down to 0, and there's no lighting in the scene. Or we can turn this up just a little bit to get some of those reflections happening in the scene. Now, you're also going to want to be able to tweak the environment placement. So you can do that with the mapping node right here. We can switch that over to something like texture. And then we can rotate the Z coordinate, which will be sort of how the rotation of the environment in our 3D world. So if you want to get some different reflections, this is an easy way to do that. Kind of reposition where the sun is at in the sky. This is a good way to do that. You can just rotate here. And then, of course, if you really want to get creative, you can also kind of rotate the world on the X or Y coordinate or axis here. So if you want to just really get some interesting reflections for something like this, it's probably appropriate to go ahead and get creative here. In a lot of cases, you wouldn't want to do this because it would kind of break the reality, the realism in your scene setup. But for now, if we're just trying to get some interesting reflections on our object, then this might be a cool way to go about doing that. So let's go ahead and play with this a little bit until we might find some values that are looking interesting. And we pick an angle that we're going to probably be looking at this logo from, maybe something kind of like that as we animate this. And then, of course, we want to rotate around in our environment until we got a little bit of interesting lighting from the top. Some reflections happening on the side a little bit here. And of course you can spend as much time as you want tweaking that and playing with that. Okay, so what's great is you can kind of take your time switching back and forth between your objects and your world settings, all in the same editor, and then really start tweaking what this looks like. So as you bring your roughness down, your reflection sharpness is going to go up, and you've got a lot of options here for what you can do in terms of your specular. You can turn on your clear coat, make that visible, and that will add sort of an extra level of the reflections for the highlights on the surface of the object, which can kind of be cool. And just tons of options to play with here, especially if you want to get in here and plug in your own custom maps, which if you are working with something like Substance, is a great way to bring over some custom PBR-based materials and just plug those right into these values here. Okay, so let's play a little bit with the interior object. So I'm going to grab this one, and this has a little bit different material for the base color. So let's play with what this is going to do. Let's turn the roughness down a little bit more. And if we want to move this up a little bit to preview what that looks like, we could do that. Or we could also grab the outside object and just press H to hide that. And now we can just tweak what this looks like. Okay, so let's unhide our other object. And now let's turn off the influence of our world and just go back to tweaking our scene lights separately. I don't like to tweak all the lights at the same time right off the bat because it makes it hard to create a scene that's balanced because you're not necessarily isolating the variables. And so a quick way to do this is just to create another background node, plug this straight into the surface, and that'll temporarily turn that off for you. And then you don't have to remember the value that you add here. You can just come back in at some point later, plug that back in, and you're good to go. So let's temporarily disable our world background. And then let's turn back on our lights right here. Okay. So now we're going to want to play a little bit with like a 3-point lighting based setup to see what else we can do with our scene here. So I'm going to switch back into the look dev. And I'm going to start by just simply duplicating this light and then rotating it around so that it's on the other side of our object here. So I might kind of line that up where it is aimed straight at our object. Reselect our logo, hit the period key on the numpad, and that will just recenter your viewport right there. Now this is still reflecting the HDR, as you can see, from the look dev preview, but of course we're not seeing that in the background. So that's kind of cool. Let's switch back into the rendered view. And now, of course, because we have our world disabled, those reflections are not going to be visible. So let's bring that back. And now we're getting some interesting lighting with everything kind of together. Okay, so you're probably not going to want your background visible, especially if you start really tweaking the rotation and stuff as you're getting in here a little bit and messing with your custom animations. So what I would recommend doing is jumping into your settings for your world, and you can kind of play with how those are appearing. And let's play with, let's look at some of these properties here and see if we can find what we need to do for these settings. So we could go into the render settings for our Eevee render engine here. Jump down into the film tab, turn on transparent. Now this is only going to affect when you actually hit F12 and you render the scene, but that's how you would set that up if you don't want that visible there. You can also do this if you have a camera. So let's go ahead and add in a camera in the scene, and then kind of pick an angle where we want to initially set the camera pointed at our logo. Once we've got that rotated into that in the 3D viewport, we can hit Control, Alt, and 0, and that will frame our camera around that in our scene. Okay, so now what we can do with our camera selected is we can jump into some of our options here and see what we have at our disposal to play with this a little bit. Okay, so I think I know what may be the issue. We do not have the same exact settings because we're using Eevee versus cycles, and I'm used to the cycles options. So there is a way to disable this in the background, but I'm not exactly sure how to do it from the current Eevee settings. So I'm gonna have to research that a little bit and get back to you guys. But you can turn it off if you actually want to render this out, which is good. So if you want to preview what everything looks like without all your light sort of objects here, your 3D cursor, just check off the overlays button, and that will show you kind of what that looks like. And then we can start playing with some of the more advanced settings in Eevee, which is kind of fun. So let's jump into some of these and take a look at what we can play with. What I love about Eevee is that it's completely live, like a game engine. So if we were to go full screen with this and just start tweaking our settings, you can see everything update and tweak your settings on the fly. So under sampling, this is going to be the same basic thing you would have with cycles. So our viewport samples are currently at 16. If we actually rendered this, it's going to be using 64. So depending on your graphics card, you can feel free to turn this up a little higher, what you're working on. And so you got shadow methods. There's a couple of options in here to play with. If you're getting some stair stepping, which is the anti-aliasing on your shadows, you can turn up your settings here for these. So go up to 1024, bump that up to 2048. Just depends on what kind of memory you have in your graphics card memory. You could bake your indirect lighting, which I'm not going to do right now, but we could do that. And then depending on what your options are in your PBR settings for your materials, you have the option to turn all of these other things on, which can really enhance the way this looks in your 3D viewport. So let's check off some of these settings that might be applicable to our material that we've set up. We're not using subsurface scattering, so this is just going to waste processing power if we turn this on right now. So I'm going to leave that off. We are using reflections, so I'm going to turn screen space reflections on, and you can see that that kind of enhances the way that these look in our reflections on our objects. So if I check this off, you can see what happens there. It gets a little bit more realistic in the way that our material reflects that stuff. You can check off refraction. That will also increase the accuracy of those reflections. But we are not really using any lights that would refract onto like a plane or anything like that right now. So let's go ahead and uncheck refraction because that's going to kind of use up some more memory. And then if you want to increase the resolution, this is automatically turned on to half res. So you can uncheck that, and then we'll get even more high def with the way this ray traces for you. I'm going to go ahead and leave that on while we're streaming. And let's pop into the chat. I see that Emerga is live with me. So is Lorenzo. Lorenzo, good to see you in the chat. So Emerga says, have you tried to set the alpha setting in film and render to transparent? Yeah, so that was one of the first things we did. If you jump into film, you can see you got sky by default, transparent's turned on. And again, that will work when you actually go to render. So if you went into the render menu, hit F12 to render this, it will render transparently. So that works correctly, but Cycles has an option that you can check off that will automatically turn off the viewport display. And now that I'm saying that, I'm wondering if it's in the overlays section here. So let me look at this. I'm not seeing it right now. Let's switch back into this. Yeah, they're changing a lot of the menus around every day. So there's things that are being added and removed, and you just kind of have to play with that. So let's go back into the rendered preview for Eevee. Let's see, we got camera, light probe. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, so Lorenzo says he's going to look it up real quick and see if he can find it. Yeah, let me know if you find it, because I'd love to know what that new, where that is, that new option for Eevee. I'm sure I'm just missing it wherever it is. So let's go ahead and continue to work through. Oh, Casey's in the chat. Hey, Casey, what's up? He's asking what CPU and graphics card are you running? I'm running an Intel. It's a Pentium. No, it's not. It's an Intel. Oh my gosh, I don't know. I'm having a crazy moment. Let me pull that up real fast, because I know sometimes that can make a difference. I built this computer about a year ago, so it's not super edgy in terms of the processing power. Yeah, it's a quad core. It's an Intel. And then the graphics cards, I'm running two AMD WX7100s that are 8 gigs each. So for cycles, that helps a lot, because the dual card setup can be used to kind of increase the amount of available memory you have for textures. If you're loading a lot of stuff into those at render time, that can be helpful. And it can also split up the tiles across 2 cards at once, so it really speeds up the processing time for cycles. But with Eevee, I'm not sure exactly what the implication is right now with 2 AMD cards. I do know if you have NVIDIA cards and any of the modern gaming cards that you're using with CUDA cores, Cycles is going to take, Eevee is going to take full advantage of those, because those are always the cards that they adapt to first, because they have a good relationship with NVIDIA. But as far as AMD goes, we're always kind of the last people to get the features in Blender for the AMD cards, because they have to write different drivers. So eventually we'll get them, but most of you have NVIDIA cards probably, so that's probably not going to be a problem. Okay, so let's play a little bit more with these settings. So we've got screen space reflections you can turn on and off. Ambient occlusion is always good. You can play with those here. And this is going to do some self-shadowing, so I'm sure you guys know what this is, but you can play with distance there a little bit, factor, and then the trace precision. Now, again, depending on your setup for the cards, it could get a little bit buggy and crashy if you just crank all these up to 11. So kind of be careful with what you're doing there. But again, feel free to download 2.8, the Alpha 2, and just start playing, because it's kind of fun to get in here and mess with stuff. So ambient occlusion's there. Volumetric we'll talk about in a second because that's pretty cool. And depth of field we'll talk about in a second, which is really cool. Bloom is really awesome. Check that off, and you're automatically going to get sort of the in-camera effects you have in like Unreal Engine or Unity when you're playing a video game. With an HDR, this is really going to pop off the screen and can really make your lighting sing. So play with these settings a little bit. The knee can develop a little bit more intensity for you if you need that. The radius can always be brought down if that's a little too intense for you. You can play with the threshold if that's getting a little hot. And then, of course, the intensity here. So it's kind of fun. And that'll, of course, depend on how you're rotated to get those reflections popping on screen, as you can see there. So if we go back into our camera, now we can kind of start talking about some of these other options here. Okay, so Lorenzo is saying I need to use a light path in the node. So let's go ahead and take a look at doing that. I think I already know what I got to do. Let's go back into shader editor, select our world. Let's add in a light. No, let's add in a light path. And I'm assuming we're going to need some sort of mix. So with that, we can go ahead and throw in the background on the top. And then the bottom, we could do something like so I'm looking at Lorenzo's comment in the chat, starting from the right to the left, another world output, mix shader, add another background, then a light path to that. Should be set to camera array. Okay, we're good. So the second background is just a black color strength. Doesn't seem like there's a transparent option. So that would typically be how I did it in cycles, would be to set up a shader and then use like a transparent node. But you're saying the second one's a background node too, Lorenzo? I'm trying to see. Yeah, we still got the reflection, so that's working. Okay, good. Okay, so for now, this'll work because we're still getting yeah, it's still a background node. Okay, I'm hoping that's right. I think it's right. And that's giving us our black background. So we turn all this off, jump back into our camera. Now we can kind of see what that looks like. Turn on overlays. So here we are. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about some of the options we have with a camera in the scene. Depth of field is only really going to work if you've got a camera, because otherwise it doesn't really know how to calculate from a camera perspective how far you are away from your objects. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and add in an object that lets us control the focus. I'm going to shrink our camera down a little bit. And then with the 3D cursor, kind of put in where we're going to want to add our object. We're going to add an object that lets the camera focus on a viewpoint in the 3D scene. So you can use the object itself, but it's not as accurate as placing like with an empty. So I'm going to use a plane axis right here. Put this wherever you want your camera to be in focus. And then if you want, of course, you can name this. Go ahead and just name this in the outliner over here. So I'm going to name this focus. Let's move this over into our objects collection. Same thing with the camera. So our lights are our lights, our objects are our objects. Okay. So let's jump back into our camera perspective here and jump into the camera options. Under depth of field, you're going to want to pick that focus object that you just created, and then we can start playing with the settings here. Now, these aren't going to work unless you turn on the master depth of field checkbox here. So we're going to want to check that off to begin with, and then we can go back to our camera settings and really start to tweak this. Now, if you don't know what depth of field is, it's basically how the lens is focusing on things, and these are based on these attributes that you would get from the world of photography or film. So f-stop is basically going to be how much your lens aperture is opening up to allow light into the camera. Low f-stops, really low f-stops mean you're going to have less distance to focus on things. High f-stops mean that more things can be in focus. So the trade-off is that a low f-stop is going to give you nice blurred out backgrounds, but it's going to be maybe a little harder to keep things in focus. And this is, of course, talking about the real world, not CG. And consequently, you're going to be able to use a lot less light in the scene because it will require less light to light things up in your shot. Now, with higher f-stops, such as 128, which is a really high f-stop, just to put that in perspective, real f-stops in the real world range between like a 1.0 all the way up to like, I don't know, f22 is probably the highest setting I've ever seen used, and that's for like outdoor photography. And as you can see, there's not much of a difference between a 128 and a 22 in the scene. So I don't know why that's so high by default, but it's a little high. So to get really out of focus stuff, you're going to want to take this down to like a 1.0. And you can see even on the edges of our logo, wherever this empty is, that's where it's going to be in focus. And as you move further away from the center of that, you're going to get more and more blurred edges on the outside. So if we kind of make this an extreme example here, the lower we get this, the more out of focus you're going to get. So if we zoom in a little bit more with the camera, you can see it's obviously using a little bit more computing power now, so it's not going to be as real time as it would have been before. So your frame rate's going to take a hit, but that's how you would start doing that. So f-stop, let's turn that back up to 1, and this is plenty usually to start really kind of showing that you've got some nice cinematic camera effects going on. You can also play with the number of blades, which is again from the real world camera lens settings. Blades that are higher in count are typically much higher dollar lenses because they give you nice round bokeh, which are out of focus blurs in the background. So we might want to turn that up to something like 14. That's a really good blade value. Rotation will change the rotation of the bokeh. And so we got nothing in the background right now that's really showing us bokeh. Let me go ahead and add something in for us. So I'm going to go ahead and add in a light, point light. Let's move this off. And I want to put this in the view of the camera back here. And we might need to change this to a maybe a area light. And you know what? Instead of a lamp, let's go ahead and use an object. So I'm going to switch back into look dev mode. And let's play with adding a plane. And we're going to use this as a light. So we're going to jump back into the material settings here. We're going to add a new one. And I'm going to use a emission shader. So let's rotate this. Again, we want to get this in the view of the camera so that we can actually see the light in the background. And that is where you're going to get bokeh. So we can actually add a simple modifier to make that into a circle, hit apply. So now we got a little bit of geometry back there. And there we go. We got a round light in the background that's going to be lighting this up. So let's crank our emission strength here. Jump back into our shaded view, turn our strength up. You can see where the edge of our camera is right here. Okay, so with really bright light sources in your scene that are out of focus, you're going to get bokeh, and that's the blurry background that you have here. So if we switch back into our camera settings, make sure we have that selected, back down our f-stop. Lower f-stops, again, are going to give you bigger bokeh, bigger out of focus areas. So if you had a bunch of these, like in a background of a skyline, that's where you get to see those really out of focus blurs. And this is where those blades come into play. So if you only have like 3 blades, you're going to get a triangular sort of bokeh effect. If you have like 5 blades, you're going to get a pentagon sort of effect. And again, to play with your ratio here. But here's where you can really start to see that pronounced. And again, the lower I crank this, the slower my system is going. So, you want to play with this in a responsible way a little bit. So let's crank this back up a little bit. But that's kind of what you're looking at with blades here. All right. Hey, Gary Smith, what's up? Glad to see you in the chat. Got a lot of people in the chat tonight. Happy to see that. Okay, so here's where we could start getting a little bit more creative. Put a few of these in the background. Of course, you can change the color if you want. These are all connected right now with the same material. So if you want to make these separate, you have to hit this little number button to make these individual materials. And then you can change this to a different color over here. Grab this one, make it a single user, and then change that to maybe a greenish color, and there you got some interesting effects going on. Okay, so that looks terrible. Let's go ahead and not do that. Okay. Again, if you duplicate these and they're using the same material, you're going to see the numbers go up here. All of those are going to be sharing those materials. So it's a great way to really quickly just test out the settings here. But this is a great way with a camera in the scene to really get some nice effects going with the background settings, especially if you don't want to have your HDRI turned on in the background. So the closer we get to our object in live preview and Eevee, the slower our viewport's going to get because it's got to play with this blur. If you want to temporarily disable that, what's great is with all of these master settings here, you can just check off that depth of field, and now your viewport's really, really quick again. So just by checking off depth of field, you can see how much of a difference that has with our speed. So until you get to a point where you really need to play with the animation or kind of render this out in the final image, you may want to leave that off. So one of the other really cool settings is volumetric, and we're already getting a little bit of that interesting type of effect with the way that it's blurring some of this on the background lights. But let's play a little bit more with some of these settings like volumetric. So volumetric is going to have a little bit to do with the atmospheric haze in your scene. And you're going to need to play again with the world settings. So I'm going to jump into the shader editor again. Let's make sure we have world selected. And now we're going to get a chance to play with some of our volumetric settings right here. So to do this, all you really need to do is start simple with a shader volume scatter. So we'll add that to the scene, plug that into our volume here. And then of course you're going to see a little bit of a change, and then we can start playing with our settings here. Now once again, you want to make sure that you check off volumetric so that it actually is turned on for the scene. We're going to have settings in here we can play with. In the beginning, again, if you can, keep your settings lower so that you're not going to really crank your system to a halt, but feel free to play around too. So the color is basically what kind of light scattering is going to occur. You can think of this as going opposite on the color wheel. So if you're going towards a pinkish color, it's going to go opposite, and that's the color you're going to get in the background. And this has to do with what colors are getting absorbed or scattering. And so if you're scattering the reds out of the atmosphere, you're going to end up with more blues. Or if you're scattering the blues out of existence in the atmosphere, you're going to get more reds. And so this is where you can kind of decide what look you're going for. But it's kind of cool to play with that. You can also play with the density. So the lower you make this, the less hazy it's going to be in the scene. The higher you make this, the more hazy it's going to be, to the point where you're really going to start kind of drowning everything out. So you want to kind of keep that in mind if you're playing with this. Anisotropy is kind of an interesting effect that will play a little bit with how blown out your extreme light sources are getting in the scene. So it really just depends on what you are going for here. so you can play with that setting as well. So if we turn the density all the way down, you can see there's nothing. Turn it up a little bit, and that's all it really takes to start getting that working in this scene. Okay, so let's also talk about some of the other options with volume atmospherics. So a more accurate way to add these in would be to use both volumetrics. So you got volume absorption and volume scatter with an add shader. If you put both of these in, you're going to get a more realistic volumetric effect. Now, coordinating these together is going to be somewhat challenging in the beginning because you're going to have to do a lot of tweaking to get these settings dialed in. But you can get a lot of interesting varied effects if you just play with how these are interacting together. So you're only going to be tweaking the original settings on both of these shaders. You're not going to have any options on the add shader, unlike the mix shader where you would have a factor to play with. But this is going to allow you to get some really interesting effects when you start rendering. So that coupled with the depth of field is really going to start adding some fun options to the scene. And of course, if you want, you can also plug in just your background, and you've got that in there as well. So that is kind of the basics for how you need to set up Eevee to start working with some of this stuff, and the rest of it's going to come down to learning how to animate and do some things with motion graphics, which is what we're going to talk about the next half of this. So yeah, so this is kind of fun, and it didn't really take that long. If you could think about how this would be setting this up in Eevee versus Cycles, and with the live preview, you're saving some time here. So it's definitely one of those things where you could save a template, import your new stuff, and then just reapply the camera animations and stuff like that. So I'm going to go back into maybe a solid view right now, so we can kind of start playing with some things. And let's talk about what we may want to do to get some animations in here. So there's a lot of things we can start tweaking, and remember, every single one of these things that we check off is a potential attribute that we can kind of start animating. And so you can play with the focus, you can play with all of the things inside of focus, such as under your camera settings here. With the camera by itself, you can play with the focal length, and so changing this would kind of be like zooming in or out with a lens, and that can create some interesting effects. You've also got the ability to play with where the focus object is, so if you want to play with animating that. If you haven't animated before, it's really, really simple. Basically, I would recommend, if you're going to get started and you don't know really how to do anything, turn on this little, where's the automatic? Right here. Yeah, turn on this little button, and that's like recording what changes you're making in the scene. And so anytime you have this on and you start moving these around, it's going to remember what you're doing wherever you are in this timeline. So I'm going to turn this off, and basically the settings for the timeline here are going to come straight out of your settings right up here in the render tab. And so frame start and end is the number of frames in your scene. This is our frame rate, and that's really all you got to know to get started. So 24 is basically what you have in a movie for film. 30 is what you would use if you're going to do like a television spot, commercial, things like that. And of course, all of these are customizable based on whether you're adding them to a video or not. So if you're going to be adding them to a video that you've recorded that's like already got a good frame rate that you know of, typically for video, if you're doing something, it's going to be 29.97, or if you're using 24 and it's video, it's going to be 23.98. And then of course, if you're using a newer, more fluid camera for like YouTubing, stuff like that, it might have a 60 frames per second frame rate there. So all of that is going to be multiplied times the number of seconds you want in your scene that you can add right here, and that's going to be the entire range of your timeline. So if you want to play with the focus, here's what I would do. Let's start on frame 1, turn on the automatic keyframing right here. Just to show you what this is doing, I'm going to hit G and left click again, and this is basically just going to put it right back where it was, but now you can see all those turn yellow, and that's basically going to keyframe every single one of these values. Anything that turns yellow, you know that on this current frame, it is locked in as these values, and it's going to remember these. And you can see it's added a little yellow dot telling us that on frame 1 we've got keyframes. So then we just need to decide how many seconds we want this to be focusing in or out on the object. And so if we were going to say, all right, well, we're 24 frames a second, so for 1 second, I want this to be animating focus. We can then move this to a new spot, maybe close to the camera like this. And as long as we stay on this 1 frame, it's just going to continually update these values for us. So we can start focused, and it will kind of end up unfocused. Or if we want to, we can switch these values. So to do that, all you would need to do is go into the animation editors and switch those around. So let's create a new tab here. We're going to jump into the dope sheet. And the dope sheet is kind of like an editor for your keyframes. So instead of editing them on the timeline down here, what you can do is jump in here and you can really get focused in on what keyframes are doing what, because you don't just have the position, you've also got rotation, you've got scale, and you may decide, well, I don't need rotation, I don't need scale. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to say, all right, well, in the dope sheet, let's get rid of the stuff we don't need. So we don't need the rotation stuff. So let's hold shift and just left click all of this stuff, and let's just hit X and get rid of it. That's only going to track the location for us from point A to point B. And so now if we were to just kind of scrub through the timeline, you can see it's doing the same exact thing it was doing, but it's only recording that X, Y, and Z location. So if we want to quickly reposition these, let's just collapse all those menus back down. And then we'll grab the first one, we'll say move it up to frame 24, and you can just left click and release. Or you can hit N to bring up your properties over here, and that will tell you, should tell you where that's at. I'm not seeing those right now, so I'm gonna show you another way to do this. So let's just move the last keyframe off to the side for a second. Let's right click on the first one, hit G, and then we're going to say 24 because we want to move that up 24 frames. Or in this case, since it starts on frame 1, let's move it up 23 frames, so G23. And then this one, we're going to go back and we want it to be on frame 0. So let's just left click and drop it right back there. And now we have those reversed. So starting on frame 1, it's going to be out of focus, and then all the way into the first second, it's going to kind of settle into the focus on our object. So let's switch back into the camera. Let's turn on our Eevee, turn off our overlays, and let's take a look at how this is working for us. So if we start here with everything out of focus, you can see we got our nice bokeh there. And then if we hit Shift Space, it's going to focus in for us. So hit Escape, it'll go back, Shift A, and there you go. If you want to extend that, again, just right click, select one of your keyframes. You might even be able to do that in the timeline. Yeah, it looks like you can. So you don't even need the dope sheet, which is great. And now we can go ahead and kind of edit how long this takes. So you don't have to be super precise in the beginning. If you're just kind of feeling this out, you can just kind of move this over, 48 seconds or 48 frames would be 2 seconds at a 24 base frame rate. And so you can just kind of ballpark where that is and then go, all right, well, that'll be about 2 seconds. So shift space. That'll kind of zoom that in for you. And again, if you're noticing you're not getting real-time playback, it'll probably just be because of your settings. So quick way to kind of get that zoned in is to turn some of those extra settings off. So if you're just wanting to preview your depth of field, you might turn off bloom and volumetric because you don't really need those to preview what the blur looks like. And that may speed things up a little bit for you. You can also turn down your viewport sample. So I turned this up in the beginning. So we might turn that back down to 16 instead of 64. That should speed things up a little bit for you too. And you can always play with how low you can take this before things start looking really kind of ugly. So at 8, it's a little faster. Go down to 4. There we go. Okay, so maybe that works. Turn off our screen-based reflections. There we go. Okay, that's looking good. So what's really cool with the focusing thing is that you can get really sophisticated with the animation. So let's kind of play a little bit with some of the advanced techniques you would need to kind of zone in on the animation for those. And to do that, we're going to switch the editor up here back into a graph editor. So this is sort of the most advanced animation editor that you have at your disposal. It's the exact same drop downs that you have in the dope sheet. So you can see we've got our X, Y, and Z location for our position of our empty. That's our focus position, keyframed here. And if we turn each one of these on and off with the little eyeball for visibility, you can see that if we kind of zoom in on this selection here by hitting A twice to select everything, and then hitting the period on our numpad, it's going to recenter our view around these two keyframes. And you can see if you've ever experienced sort of keyframe animation before, you kind of know what these curves mean. Basically, the curves are based on slopes, and they're either linear or they're Bezier. And so with these, it kind of eases into the first part of the animation, and then it kind of settles into a constant speed. And then as you get towards the end of the animation, you can see that it slows back down and eases back into that. If you wanted to make these linear, where it wasn't easing in and slowing down, you could select these and hit V, and then just say vector, and that would make that a linear curve. And so now if we preview the animation, there's going to be no start and stop that's very, very smooth. It's just going to be instantaneously one speed all the way across. So you can see what that does. So it looks like it's still kind of easing into it, but based on this X location, it's not. Now the reason that looks that way is because we haven't changed that for the Y and the Z location. So if we turn this on, select both of these, hit V and then vector, and then we select the Z location, recenter that, hit V and then vector. Now all three of these are going to be linear, and there's no easing. So now if we play this back, you're going to see it's very linear in nature. Starts fast, ends fast, and it's just abrupt. It ends. So you can do a lot of custom things with this. Basically, you can just select, click in here, and then hit Alt-A to get rid of all of my selection. Select the last group of keyframes by hitting B to box select these three. And then if I hit V to start setting the handle types again, I can say automatic, and that'll put those back into an ease. So it'll start at a certain rate, but the whole time it's going to ease into that final resting place for this focus. So you may start to focus fast like you would with a real camera, and then as you get closer to your object, you want to slow down because you don't want to go past it, right? And so you can now see what that looks like. Hit Shift A, bam. Now that's a little too perfect. You're not going to lock focus that easily. So if you want to make this a little bit more realistic, you're going to want to add some more keyframes to kind of play with zoning that in. So what we might want to do here is go, okay, well, maybe at this point in the animation, we want to have gone too far with this, okay? So let's switch back into our look dev here, turn our overlays back on, and we've got our focusing object right here, and you can see that animate. So at this point, it slows down, and it's at a perfect place. We want it to shoot past that and be in the wrong place and then have to back up. So let's go ahead and just move this, and we want to make sure we're at the right place in our timeline, and then let's turn on the automatic keyframing, and then we'll move it past it because we've overshot it, and then you're going to see it's going to come back. So now what happens is it's going to go past, and then it's going to go, oh, and it's going to come back. Okay, so let's jump back into our viewport here, and let's see what that looks like. So start at the beginning, and you can see it kind of starts to search a little bit like you would get in the real world. So maybe here we've got it, a couple of these happening, these actions. So maybe we select these keyframes. Let's pull them back to about here. And rather than do this in the graph editor, because it's going to get a little tricky with all of these extra settings, I'm going to do that in the dope sheet, or I'm going to do that down here. So once again, let's get rid of all the extra things we don't need to be animating, like the rotations and the scales. And now we just have these to focus on. So down here, got these. Let's move those back over to here. So we've already gone too far at this point. As you can see here, too far, then we come back. So I'm going to have it, when it comes back, I'm going to have it overshoot again, but it's going to happen earlier. So now we're going to have the focus come back too far again. So now you're going to see over, over, and then finally it rests in the right place. And once we have that, let's preview. And this is kind of the process you'd go through. You'd start at the beginning and just get a little bit more complicated every time you play with the animation. So now that we've got some basic things in place for getting that focus looking a little bit more realistic, now it's about playing with the timing a little bit. So before we get into editing really advanced things with these curves, you want to play with the distance between these keyframes. So let's go ahead and grab the last one. And what you're going to do is you're going to see it kind of start fast. And so to make things happen quickly, you're going to want less distance between these keyframes. So it's going to quickly overshoot, and then you're going to go, oh no, I didn't mean to overshoot. And so you're going to want to bring that other keyframe back closer because you're going to want to overcorrect quickly. And then you're going to go, okay, I went too far again, so now I'm going to want to slowly zoom in and recorrect the focus. So then you go, okay, well, that needs to happen a little bit more gingerly, a little bit easier. So now you're going to want to slowly get back to that final focusing point. So let's preview what that looks like. There we go. So that looks a lot more like what a real cameraman would do. They'd start quickly trying to find that focus. And maybe that's a little too fast. Let's spread this out some more. Grab these, spread that out a little bit more. And what's great about doing this down here versus up in the graph editor is that with the graph editor, you got to be careful not to just grab one of these curves. You want to grab all of the keyframes for that one section, and you can kind of mess that up if you don't have the zoom set at the right place, because there might be something out of the zoom range up here that you can't see. And so if you do this in the dope sheet, or if you do this on the timeline, you're not going to accidentally not select these sort of things. So I would only get into the graph editor when you're really ready to start dialing in your final dynamics for your animation. And we'll talk about that in a second. Okay, so sticking down here to the timeline, which is really just an uncomplicated dope sheet. Now let's go ahead and test our speed here. So, okay. So once we find out we go too far, we want that to happen a little quicker to compensate. And then we want that to take something like that, maybe. And you can see how much I'm tweaking the timing here and how much I'm trying to get it zoned in, because I really want to make sure that, I'm making this look realistic in terms of the speed. And it's hard to nail that down without playing around and testing this out. So this is why it's important to do this first. Okay, so I'm just hitting escape to quickly jump back to the beginning of the timeline there. And let's play through the very first part. Okay, I don't like how quickly that bam eases into that. So let's decide what's going on and what we may need to fix here. So I think it's that I think it feels like you realize way too quickly that you've overshot, and then you overcompensate too fast. And so we're actually going to need some more keyframes in here. Let's go ahead and move to somewhere in between these two. And let's play with another keyframe. Now what I want to do here is I want to actually have a holding keyframe where there's no movement happening in the scene. So to do that, I'm going to select the first time that you focus too far behind the object, and I'm going to duplicate that. I'm just going to hit Shift D, and then I'm going to move that over kind of halfway in between these two keyframes. Now you can see what that does is it creates this orange sort of lines that are connected all the way across. And then if we look in the graph editor, you can see that there's 0 speed in terms of the change between this point and this point. And that's because nothing's going on. There's no movement happening on this object. And so for this amount of time after you hit this, you're basically pausing. There's nothing going on. And you want those to be flat for those holding keyframes. You don't want any kind of curvature going on there. So now what we can do is decide, all right, well, how long do we want that pause to happen before you realize you've gone too far? And we're actually going to want another pause when you overcompensate again in front of the object. So let's grab this keyframe, Shift D to duplicate that. And this one's going to be a little shorter than this one because we're going to be trying to compensate a little bit more accurately each time. So once we pause, we go, oh no, we've overshot this. Let's zoom back a little bit. Oh no, we've overshot this again. Okay, let's correct again. And then bam, now we hit our target. So let's look at this. Okay, so you can see that the timing is now a little bit better. It's the amount of the distance is a little off still. So we're gonna want to play with these. Let's grab these, and again, a little too long. So let's pull these in a little bit. But we still definitely want those holding positions to be there. So let's try this again. Okay, it's still a little too long here. So once again, let's grab all 3 sets. And I'm just going to pull those in a little bit. We don't need to hold long. We just need to hold enough to make it feel like we are thinking about what we're doing. There's a little bit of hesitation there. Yeah, that's better. Maybe the second one's a little bit shorter. You can see now we're down to tweaking 1 frame at a time in terms of the length, and that's where you're starting to really dial in that animation. Because 1 frame can make all the difference in the world in terms of how this feels. And of course, the more you kind of overshoot and compensate, the more it's going to feel kind of realistic. Because as someone manually focusing in a real shot, there's going to be a lot of really, really subtle back and forth with that focusing action. And so a good cameraman's obviously going to be smooth, but no one's perfect. And so you're going to get a little bit of hunting happening there. And that just increases the realism a little bit as we go. Okay, so again, let's pull in the length 1 frame on each of these. And let's try that again. Okay, I think I want these to be further apart, so let's try that. That's better. Okay, so I'm happy with that. So now let's play with some dynamics. And dynamics are basically not the speed of the animation, not how far you're animating, but how you're easing into and out of those curves. It's the mood of your movement, and it's what gives it a lot of flavor. And so let's talk about what that looks like. So at a really simple level, basically the way that you can think of this is that the slopes that are going into and out of your keyframes, if they're smooth, then you're getting some easing happening. So you're not going to be getting really sharp, jagged kind of movements. But sometimes it's necessary to have sharp curves where they collide and they have mountains and hills and things that aren't always smooth, and that's going to give you a little bit more flavor. So you see that we added some extra keyframes here to kind of do the overshooting. Well, we could have also done that by just tweaking some of the curves so that they're kind of going over for us. So if we look at the way this is kind of working, we can add a little bit more dynamic movement even in between these holding keyframes by slightly enhancing the curvature here. Now, not by a lot, but just enough to kind of give us a sense of interest. So let's start by selecting this one down here for this holding position. And remember, there's no movement right now between these two, but we're going to change that a little bit. So now if we overshoot a little bit on each of these, and I'm just going to kind of very subtly tweak how these are lining up here. It's almost barely noticeable, but you can see the highlights in the background really subtly kind of shifting a little bit, and that's really going to bump up that realism. So you're going to tweak the curves so they kind of lead into each other. And if they line up and they lead into each other in a very fluid fashion, you're not going to get any really jerky motions. You're going to get really smooth movement. So now you can kind of see what that's doing for us. We'll do the same thing on this one over here. So let's put our timeline position over here in the middle. And let's create another sort of smooth motion. Now you're seeing what's also happening on this other side is that we're getting some extra motion happening without keyframes over here. And that's where we're getting into really utilizing the graph editor to our advantage, because we don't necessarily want to add more keyframes than we need to, because it's going to get way more complicated to control what's going on. And so if you know how to use curves to kind of create extra movement over here without keyframes, then you're going to have less of a hard time controlling what's going on, but you're going to get a lot more bang for your buck in terms of that movement. So let's go back to the first part over here. So again, we're starting at a constant speed. This is almost like we've cut to this shot and we're already got the cameraman in the middle of focusing, right? There's no pause at the beginning. Now, if we wanted there to be a pause at the beginning, all we would need to do is select all of our keyframes, or better yet, remember, select them all down here. And that's going to make sure those are all grabbed. And then we're just going to add a little bit of time in the beginning, maybe 10 frames where nothing's going on. So now you can see it doesn't immediately start moving. It's going to pause a second and then start moving. And maybe we need to add, let's add a full second and a half or so, something like that. Okay, so I'm not a huge fan of that really jagged motion right at the beginning. I want something that, you know, kind of ramps into it, but quickly. So let's go ahead and duplicate this first set of keyframes, move it back to the beginning, and then we're going to do the exact same thing we did over here, and I'm going to show you kind of what we're going to do with this second set of keyframes so that we're not getting these really sharp drop-offs, because that's what's creating that really jagged bam. I don't want that. That looks way too unnatural. So we're going to grab all three of these keyframes at the same time, hit V, and then I'm going to say let's do free, and that's going to let us move these handles individually. And what I want to do is I want to really subtly match the curvature so that it's not a sharp corner, but it's kind of moving into that. So to do that for each of these, I'm going to decide, all right, well, this is going down, it's sloping down to ramp into the animation. And that kind of means we need to start by giving it a little bit of an intro to that curvature. And so what that's doing is that's softening that corner a little bit so that we're not getting such a crazy motion. I'm going to do that on both sides, and we're not giving it a perfect, rounded off corner. We're just giving it a little bit of help so that it's not so jagged. And we're going to do that on all three of these. So this one, we're going to go down a tiny bit just so that we lead a little bit more into that. We can come back towards this a tiny little bit so we lead into that. Same thing on this one. We'll go down a tiny bit, maybe a little closer to that second set of keyframes. And instead of going up into that slope, let's go down a tiny bit. So again, not completely rounding this off, but just a tiny bit there so that these are all a little bit better off. So let's move the timeline back to the first position over here, and let's see what that looks like. Yeah, so it's a little bit more natural. And if you're getting a little bit too much movement early on, remember you can also start off by going a little higher and even more compensate for that offset there so that the curve is going into one continuous, nice, smooth motion. And you're just giving it a little bit of wiggle along the way to create some interesting movement. So yeah, you see how that really kind of subtly eases into that? And that's exactly what we're looking for. So that's what would happen on a real set. The cameraman would say, all right, I'm ready to start focusing. And his brain would kick in, and then that would have to go and hit his hand, and his fingers would start moving. That all happens in a really quick sequence, but you ramp into that motion, right? It's not instantaneous. You're not a robot. So there's not a 1 millisecond kick in your fingers that just, turn that like a gear on a motor. You've got your hands that subtly want to start finessing that into place. And this is what will do that for you in the graph editor. And if that happens too quickly right there, you got a couple of options after you hit this moment where that's, and the reason that's happening so fast is for two reasons. One, it's the distance between these two sets of keyframes, and it's also the steepness of this curve. And so if you don't want that to happen so intensely right at the beginning, this is where those dynamics come into place. Because maybe what you need to do is ease in this curve a little bit more, because you like the timing, you like where that's set up, right? But you don't like the way that's animating from this point to this point. And so this is where the curvature helps you. This is where you can say, okay, for these 3 keyframes right here, we have to keep the slope the same in terms of the distance between these two. But we can change the way the curve happens. So instead of it being an equal ease from beginning into the middle into the end, we can really ease in the beginning and then really speed up in the end. And let me kind of show you what that looks like. So to do this, you would just pull the keyframe handles over to where you're still going to have to speed up at some point to get to this keyframe, but it's going to happen later in time. And then if you do that on all 3 sets of these, you can see what you're doing. You're getting an easier slope here, so it's less intense, and then you'll speed up, and then eventually it'll smooth back out, right? And so you'll see the difference here in a second when we play this back. So just that one little tweak on all 3 of those is all you need to really change the feel of this. And you can see how less jarring that is, right, with the way that moves. And you can see we're just talking about focus right now. That's all we're talking about. But you can see the amount of time we've taken, half an hour or so, to really make sure that this works. And this is what motion graphics and doing this is all kind of about, is really focusing in on how do I make this shot look sexy, right? And in terms of filmmaking, this is where you can really start getting creative with your camera movements. It's not always about having the most intense animation on your graphics as it is about having the camera interact in a playful way with what's on the screen, because half of the battle is really getting the viewer to feel like they're dynamically interacting with what's going on. And the more you can get dual and triple and quadruple interactions happening on the screen with different elements, the more energy your shot's going to feel like it has. And a lot of times that's kind of what you want. You don't always need it, but energy can be good for a lot of things. So let's play this back one more time. Okay, so we've animated one element now to kind of give us some fun things to look at for this shot. But focus by itself is not going to get us to a point where everything looks really amazing and we've got a nice finished shot and everything. That's kind of boring, right? Because we're not looking at a landscape, we're looking at a motion graphic. So this is where we need to kind of start talking about layering up elements in the scene to animate. So what are the other options we have at our disposal for what we can animate? So even within the camera, we still have tons of things that we can play with. Like I said, we've got focal length. So if I turn off my automatic keyframing, so nothing is keyframed when I do this, you can see that as I change my focal length, I'm basically zooming in and out right here, right? And this is different from moving the camera, because by moving the camera in and out, it looks kind of like you're doing the same thing, but this is completely different. And it's important to know that, because focal length is it's like having a different lens on your camera, okay? And you've got wide angle lenses, you've got 18 millimeters, super wide, you've got 50, which is sort of what your eyesight sees with your human eyes. You've got 85, which is more of like a portrait lens, and then you've got super telephotos at like 200 millimeters. And basically what this is doing is that it's changing your perspective inside the camera, or inside your view here. And so with wider lenses, your vertical lines in your objects, they're going to kind of converge towards sort of a vanishing point at the bottom of your image if you're looking down, or if you're looking up at something, your verticals are going to kind of converge up towards a point up top in a cone sort of way. That doesn't happen as much with focal lengths that are on the higher telephoto range here. So the higher you make these values, the flatter your verticals are going to look, and the more parallel they're going to be if you're looking at your camera. So if I turn this up to like a 200 millimeter focal length, and then I zoom back out, so I reframe this, you can see that completely changes the way my logo looks. Now it looks like maybe a building from really far away that I've zoomed in on, and I've got all of my verticals, you know, here it's straight up and down, here it's straight up and down, here it's pretty much straight up and down. But if I instead change this to like an 18 millimeter, and then I reframe this so it's the same sort of distance from the object, now my verticals are way out of whack. they're really skewed. So the vertical back here is kind of going down towards the middle. This one's really curved in. This one's really curved in. You can see it's at a 45-degree angle from the frame of my camera right here. And so we can actually animate this, which is kind of an interesting effect. The other option you have is to move the camera. So in this case, what we would be animating is the local z-axis. And so if we take a look at our positioning here, we could try to animate these values right here, but these are our global attributes. And what we want to instead be doing is animating our local or our normal attribute here. Okay, and so this is only going to allow us to change things in the 3D viewport that we animate. It's not going to allow us to change over here. And so typically in the other version of Blender, there's a setting that you can switch from global to local here, but I don't see that. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to use another object to help us make this work. So I'm going to grab another empty. Let's put it right about here. And we'll make this one a different shape, maybe a circle. Okay. And this is going to be kind of like a camera rig for us. So I'm going to grab our camera here. I'm going to shift right click the circle that we just added that was an empty. I'm going to hit Control P. And I'm going to say Object, Keep Transform. Okay. So now what we're going to be able to do is animate two things. We can animate the master rig object right here. And we can also animate the camera separately. So one inside of the other. And so with that, you can have a lot of interesting extra movement because you've kind of got a way to rig the camera up for you. So we can use this to kind of do what we did with our focus. We want to start sort of where we are in the scene, and what we might do is create another view that we can actually look at with the camera. So let's hit 0 to go into that. And now if we move this object, you're going to be able to see kind of what's happening in the camera view. Okay. So here's what we're going to do. The camera is going to move one way, and this is going to move another way. And so since we've got this kind of positioned centrally around our object, we're going to add a couple of types of movement. First thing we're going to do is we're going to play with the camera zoom a little bit. So this is going to alter our focus. It's going to alter, you know, all the stuff we just set up for our focus is going to be affected by this. So we need to kind of play with that and make sure we're not going to, you know, mess things up with how we have that planned out. So we know that our focus starts out of focus. It eventually lands into focus somewhere around 102, okay? So somewhere around there, we got to kind of be back in the same position. So with that in kind of the right position, we want to keyframe this. So let's grab our camera. Let's turn on our little automatic keyframe, or let's go ahead and actually do this manually, and so I can show you what this looks like. So what we're going to want to do here is grab one of these locations or rotations or scales here. And if you want to keyframe that, you basically just right click on that and say insert a single keyframe. So that's only going to keyframe this one attribute by itself. And as we play with this location, you can see that's going to kind of go up and down just like that. And I'm going to actually go ahead and delete that keyframe, and then we're going to play a little bit more with local transform here. So what we're going to need to do is keyframe all three of these because we're going to want to zoom in on the local z-axis of the camera. So to do that, you have to hit G to start moving the camera. Then you want to hit Z. So now we would be going in the global z-axis. Now you want to hit Z again to go along the local z-axis. And you can see at the local z-axis, it's moving along one single line in and out of the camera normal, but it's also changing all three of the location values simultaneously. So that's why we're going to have to keyframe all of those. So right around 102, we want all of these to be keyframed. So we're going to right click anywhere in here, and we're going to say insert keyframes. That's going to keyframe all of those. And then before that, we can zoom back out to maybe the first frame. And we can say, all right, well, why don't we start off a little closer to this object? So let's hit G and then tap Z twice. And then let's zoom in to somewhere around here. Okay. So now I want to make sure I'm on the right keyframe, so I'm not overwriting these. And I've got my camera in the right place, and I'm going to right click and say insert keyframes again. And now we've got our curves in place. So now, if we were to look at this in Eevee, you can see we're really out of focus here. As we move in, we're getting some dual motion. We're getting some focusing happening with our focus object, and we're also getting some in and out happening with our camera position. Now, that's 2 levels of movement. We've got some Z depth happening with our in and out, which is contributing to a lot of the blur, and it's really looking like nothing here, but now it's starting to come into focus. That's one type of dynamic movement. I'm gonna get a drink here real fast, guys. Okay. We want to add in some extra movement. So the more we can layer this up, and this is a general rule, it's not going to apply universally, but the more we can layer things up, the more interesting this is going to kind of look. So let's now select our master camera rig object over here, and we're going to add in a little bit of a sweep around. So if we rotate this around the Z-axis, you can see we're getting even more dynamic motion happening there. Okay, so we're going to start off again. Now we can start playing right around the same end of our focus over here. We're at 102. We're going to want our sort of rotation to end up where we want it here. So let's say somewhere around there, and we can rotate any way we want. And maybe that's good. Okay, so now we can say, all right, all we want to rotate or copy into this is the rotation. So we're going to right click and say insert keyframes, and then we're going to go back to the beginning over here, and we're going to say, all right, what I want to do here is let's rotate back around maybe over here somewhere. Okay, and then we're going to say, all right, insert keyframes there. So now if we have all of those select in the graph editor, you can see we got a lot of movement happening right here. So we're going to play that back. So we got a lot of things going on. And what we have right now is we have all of these lined up one on top of another. So if we were to select our focus, that's going from 1 to 102. If we were to select our camera motion, that's going from 1 to 102. And if we were to select our camera rig, that's going from 1 to 102. So because they're on top of each other, it's not very dynamic. It's happening way too perfectly, and it feels artificial. So we need to kind of move these timing around, these keyframe sort of positions where they are in the timeline so that they're offset a little bit. And when you offset that stuff, again, it just feels like a little bit more random, feels like it wasn't intentional, and it makes it feel a little bit more natural. So let's start by seeing if there's anything that's just kind of crazy off here. So we may decide that at this point we need our camera to kind of be finished moving backwards. Maybe it's already with the focus, it's happening really fast, and that's not good, and you know, it may just be too much. So let's play with this a little bit. Let's grab our end keyframe for our distance here for our camera, and let's just move it back over to where it finishes, maybe around halfway through. So now if we play this back again, we got a little bit of offset there. So the zoom out is going to happen quicker than the spin around, and then the focus is going to happen and stop right about here. Now maybe we want the zoom around to continue past this. Maybe it happens all the way to, you know, the end of the shot. So maybe the shot is, I don't know, you know, 5 seconds long. So we're going to be somewhere over in here, and now we've got the focus going from 0 to 100-ish. We've got the camera going from 0 to 50-ish, and then we've got the spin around going from 0 to 150. So all 3 of those are ending in different places. You can also have them start in different places. And so if you wanted to, we could not start rotating till later. I kind of like it from the very beginning, kind of subtly moving, right? I think that kind of works. But we are free to make like any kind of decision we want here with any of these other objects. And so we may not want to start focusing until later. So now let's select all of these, and all of the tweaks that we made in these graph curves are going to stay the same. We're just going to kind of play with the timing a little bit. So what's great about this is you're free to go in and out and kind of mess with the the timing separately from the dynamics, and it's not like you have to do this in a very linear order. If you want to do this and kind of jump in and out of sequences, that's totally fine. And just by offsetting a few frames up or down, it will really change, again, the feel of all of this. So let's play this back. Okay, so there we go. It's kind of interesting. We can also parent the location of this to our camera rig as far as the focus goes. So let's try that and keep the transform and see if that will move now without messing up our keyframes as it focuses in and out. And it looks like it will. So that's pretty cool. Let's turn off our overlays over here so we can just see what's in our rendered view. Yeah, so that's kind of cool. So now what we can do is we can say, all right, well, now we're rotating. We're going to want more of these. So let's grab these in the background, jump into a top view, and let's kind of duplicate those. And then I want to rotate around the 3D cursor. So where's my rotation? There we go. Sorry, still getting used to the new 2.8 features here. Okay, that's weird. I would have thought that that would have rotated. Ah, there we go. Sorry. Yeah. Okay, so maybe that's how we changed to normal, or yeah, I don't know. We'll have to play with that. But yeah, this is how you would duplicate the lights. So we just want to give enough all the way around that we have something to look at in the background. And so now, no matter how we rotate, we're always going to have something going on to kind of view there. Okay, so based on where we kind of end here, we want to wrap our shot length. So let's go back to our render settings, and let's say we're going to wrap this on frame 150. That's going to reset kind of where our timeline is down here. And we can zoom in and make sure that's kind of centered between the left and right hand side of our timeline screen there. And now we can see if there's anything else we want to play with for this animation. So let's turn back to our preview here. I'm going to try to make this a little bit bigger so you guys can see this better. And then let's see if this plays back. Yeah. So it's a little choppy because I'm streaming and this is full screen, and I'm taking up a lot of graphics processing right now, but you guys can get the idea there. Okay, so we got about 15 minutes left. If there's anything else you guys have questions about or you want me to talk about as far as creating some motion graphics and some cool things you can do, let me know. There's a lot of other things we can animate. You can animate the lights in terms of flickering. You can animate the background. You can animate the atmospheric settings in terms of your volumetrics. So if we were to turn all of this stuff back on, I'm going to go ahead and save this because I may want to reopen it again someday. Just remember, if you're going to save something in 2.8, you can't open it in 2.79, so it's not backwards compatible. But yeah, that's where we are. So good to see you, Aquavite, in the chat. You want me to work on flickering lights. Okay, so this is, again, really simple. all of these are using some form of similar material. So basically we just have to decide how many of these we need to work on. With the look dev turned on, it's a little bit easier to sample what that looks like. So for each one of these, we basically want to jump into the settings here and pick what we want to animate. You can animate color, you can animate strength, and strength is what you would want to animate for the flickering. And so again, this is going to be playing with curves. So let's jump in here and mess with this. So flickering lights, basically you're just alternating the strength up and down in a very sort of random way. And so what you'd want to do is jump back to the beginning of the timeline, and let's just say we want to have these flickering the entire time, and then we can play with that. But we'll start by right-clicking on the strength value and just saying Insert Keyframe. You can see that's going to add keyframe down here again, and then also add a keyframe from your shader tree and your value for your material setting. Because remember, these are not lights; these are mesh emissions. So basically, once you have that setting, you just need to decide how long in between the flickers you want the lights to dim in and out. And I would really recommend making these really short increments. And then you can go brighter, you can go lower, bigger, whatever you want to do. So now we'd want to drop this down to 0, and then right click, insert a keyframe, and you can see those are only like 2 frames apart. And you want these to happen in a very linear way, because remember, these are moving at the speed of light. So rather than having these ramp into each other with an ease, we're going to select both of these, hit V, and then we're going to hit vector, so those are aligned. So it's going to basically just snap on and off, on and off, on and off like this. Now, it's not a great idea to animate this custom all the way through your entire timeline if you can avoid it, because that's a real pain in the butt, and ultimately it's not necessary because Blender has options to help you animate this for you. So what you want to do is create a cyclical type of animation here for this flicker action. So we're going to go into the options here. We're going to look under extrapolation mode, and you can see under the options here, we've got constant, linear, make cyclic, and this is the one you're going to want to play with. You're basically going to add a modifier to your curve the same way you would add a modifier to a mesh. So if you click this, you can see it's automatically going to start generating that flicker for you. If you hit N to bring up your options in the graph editor, you can start playing with the modifier tab, and here's your cyclic modifier. So you can turn that on and off, just like that. And then you've got all of these options for how to offset things and things like that. So you've got repeat motion turned on here. You've got repeat with offset. You've got repeat mirrored, and this will go up and down, up and down, up and down. So this is what we're kind of want to do. So let's start with no cycles before, and then afterwards we're going to want to repeat mirrored. And what this will do is go from on to off to on to off to on to off to on to off, and over and over and over again. And this will do an infinity all the way through the entire timeline. And so, fair warning, if you have epilepsy, don't watch the next part, because this is going to give you some headaches. But if you were to hit shift space, you can see that's going to basically flicker those on and off, and you can see your real-time playback over here. Okay, so this is what you'd want to do for everything. You'd want to grab this one, you'd want to start here, and you'd want to say, all right, strength is 5, insert a keyframe. Let's go up a couple of keyframes, strength is 0, right click, insert keyframe, and then grab these, hit V, turn those to vector to make them linear, and let's add a modifier of cycles. This one doesn't really matter, but this one does. You want to go repeat mirrored, and then that's going to be flickering. And then you only got 2 keyframes to edit. So if you still want to edit how long the flicker lasts between, you can edit 1 keyframe, and it will change that for all of them. Or you can edit the offset and then play with these settings. So if we were to select that and move it over 1, and then to select the original, you can see now those flickers are going to happen not lined up on top of each other. They're going to flicker with alternating lights, sort of like Christmas lights would. And then let's say here we want to start with the 3rd position. Let's go ahead and insert a keyframe. Go up a couple of keyframes, go down to 0, insert a keyframe. There we go. select those, hit vector, cycles, and there we go. Okay, so now if we select all 3 types, we've got really, really crazy different types of flickering happening here. Of course, some of these are going to be brighter than others because we set those up differently. The timing is definitely going to switch around. So again, you just want to offset these as much as you can so there's not happening right on top of each other unless that's what you want. So now if we hit shift space, you can see we've got that going on. Now, that's a little bit unnatural in the sense that it's really, really fast and they're all lined up and all of that sort of stuff. So what you can do is start playing with the timing a little bit more. So let's select one of these. Let's grab this one and let's offset how long it takes it to flicker. You can also introduce more keyframes if you want that'll mirror. So if you wanted to hit Shift D right here and have it flicker a little bit, you can just have a longer sequence that it has to follow in order to see what that's doing there. So you can, again, make these linear where they hold, which means that they're off for more than one keyframe. So when it turns off, it'll hold for a while and then come back on. Then it may stay at that level for a bit longer. And then there you go. And so that's how I would start getting in here and making this look a little bit more realistic, is just play with these. Like this. And again, it's still mirroring all of that stuff. So as you're looking at the cycles, you can see this is how many times it's happening now. And the cycles are going to get, less and less frequent, but they're going to be more custom as well. Yeah. Wow, so I'm missing stuff in the chat. You're very welcome, Aquavite. Happy to help with the animation tips. Casey Bowie says, I'm a noob, so please don't be annoyed. I'm looking for an example of how to structure my folders for Blender so I have consistency. Is there a standard way? I can give you a little bit of tips real quick on that. Let me go ahead and wrap this part of it up before we sign off so you guys can get a preview of what this looks like. And then I will be happy to jump in here and kind of show you what that needs to do. So again, you can get really creative if you want to with the cycle of that there. But that's how you would do that. And so now if we look over here in the finished output, hit zoom out a little bit so this won't just crank to a halt. Let's save again and then hit shift space and let's see what this does. So yeah, not super realistic. I mean, you'd want to spend more time planning this out so that if you're going to do a city in the background or something with buildings that looks more like city lights would, you think of these as lights that you would have if you were going to do cars on a road in the background with headlights. This is a great way to do that. So there's a lot of different things you can pull off here with this, but it's all about how creative you want to get. Okay, so let's talk real quick about Casey's question, which is the structuring. So let me know if this is really kind of not what you're talking about, but I'm happy to kind of tweak what I'm saying if this is not what you're aiming for. I'm gonna go back into some of my personal projects and let's take a look at a course I'm currently working on. And okay, so this is kind of how I structure my stuff. This is not the best example of a completely clean directory structure for my Blender files, but it's kind of what is helping me work through this one, and this is kind of a bigger scene. So if we jump into the test renders section, I can kind of show you what this looks like. This is sort of the work in progress of a course that's coming out next month that I'm teaching on 3D illustration. And so because there's a lot of objects in this scene, there's a need for doing a lot more organizational structure with the Blender files, because there's textures, there's obviously blend files, there's works in progress, there's scene files. All of those are completely separate, and without organization, you're right, it can get way out of control real fast. So let me kind of talk about how I broke this one down for you. Okay, so right off the bat, I like to have a main folder for my projects, and these are going to have sort of the big files that contain scenes. Now, um, early on, when you're blocking out your stuff, you can start with something simple and keep everything in one Blender file. If you can keep the file sizes low, you can see some of these are pretty, like 26 megabytes, that's not bad. Now, later on, when you start getting into bigger and bigger scenes, it's not going to be practical to do that. These two are 2 gigs, almost 3 gigs a piece. That's not good, right? And the only reason I'm keeping these around here is because for the things that I'm working on right now, they have certain things that are backed up, and I want those readily accessible right away in case I screw something up, and then I can go back to those and pick up where I left off. But typically, you don't want to save an entire folder full of those because it's just wasteful. So for my test scenes and things that I'm just playing with, I keep those local. I don't do links or anything like that. But with these bigger scene files, you can see with this one, like scene 15, if we open that one up, I've got a lot of things linked into this one. And so if you look at these objects, I've got on the first layer, I've got all of these objects kind of here, and those have been cleaned so that they're being brought in from other scene files, and they're not local. So some of this stuff is still here and is embedded in the file, but a lot of this stuff is it's pretty low poly, not taking up a lot of room. And the stuff that is, I'm trying to clean it up so that it is imported from another file. So the way you would do that is you just go to File, and then you go to Link, and then you pick something you want to throw in here. Let's say it's Pocket Watch, Objects, and then I want to throw in the case. So I say Link from Library, and now we've got our Pocket Watch case pulled in here. Okay, and that's not actually saving all of that data in your Blender file. That's just saving like a copy of it, so it knows where it's located in the 3D viewport, and it's leaving all of that original data in the other file. So if you've never used links before, that's something you need to get into. Just go to File, Link. You can right-click and look up what that does in the online manual, and that is a good thing to get into. But basically, I've got all my objects in one layer. On layer 2, I've got all my lights. And that's how I sort of start organizing my Blender file. In layer 3, I've got some dynamics. This is particles and some steam and other stuff in this section over here. So let me go ahead and jump back to my folders, because that's what you're asking about. So starting here, I've got textures. These are really organized into all of the different things for my scene. So these are organized by each object. So basically, I've got like my desk, right? And my desk has a folder, and inside of that, I've got all my substance files. So if we were to open this up in Substance Painter, you can see that I've exported that from Blender, pulled that open in Substance. I've taken that and painted it. And let's see what this looks like. Let this load for a second. Okay, so we can't see it right now. I don't know if it's not loaded all the way or if my lights are not on. But anyways, I've got my substance stuff here where I'm painting all my stuff up. And then I export all my maps to separate files here for my PBR textures. And then any of the custom stuff I work on in Photoshop has its own folder, so that stuff's in there. And then every object has that. So my HDRs and stuff like that, I keep on the outside. Those are a little different. Test maps I'm working on, stuff like that. But basically textures are there. Test renders is something I keep going all along the way that show works in progress, so I can share stuff with you guys. I've got some cache folders here, which have particle caches and bakes and stuff. But in terms of the main folder structure, it's textures, test renders. Reference is really important for modeling and stuff from objects and pulling those in, so those are pulled off the web. Concepts are like my personal concept art for the stuff in the scene. So I draw that stuff and then use that in the background for reference as I'm working on files, and this is the original concept art and stuff like that. And that's important to have just as you're working on different things. So that's the basic setup for when I'm working on stuff. And each one of these is a little different, depends on how complicated the project is. It grows as you grow. And so if you're looking at, let's see if I can pull up some of my older files here. So this is like a really big project that I submitted as a 3D illustration. So if we look at just how big this is on some of the test composites, let's see if I've got some final renders. Let's see. Let me show you a finished version of this real quick. Okay, so this is the project that I'm about to show you, and I had terrains, and I had trees and separate objects there. All of these other models were modeled separately in separate files. Those were all linked in. People, I got lots of stuff. So same basic principle if we look back at those. So let me jump into some of the stuff. So backup folder is for old stuff because I spread this out over a long period of time. Again, concept art, we got preview renders, reference, final renders. Test composites were like Photoshop files where I took the final versions of all my renders and then throw those together in a Photoshop comp. And then textures. And then, of course, each one of these bigger scenes was made up of smaller scenes. So if you look at the final project, these are the project files, as you can see here. And those are made up of tons of smaller Blender files, like the silhouettes, the people, the sword. This has several versions, as you can see here. And accessories, the beach. All of those things were made separately and then just brought in. So let me jump back in and look at some of your questions. So yeah, I kind of do nest everything within the Blender folder, the project folder, but it's you try to work as smart as you can to kind of separate things out as you go, so that you're being organized. I mean, if you link everything early, the benefit is that you can start tweaking things and make changes. And then if you have tons of separate shots, like the example tonight where we're doing motion graphics, if you had several different shots of motion graphics that use the same types of objects, like text objects that you want to use between several different camera angles, then you can save one version of the object, link that into all of those other separate shot files with different camera animations, and then anytime you change that object file one time and save it, it'll update automatically with all those other objects or camera files that you're creating for your shots. So that's a bonus. It's more headache because you're not going to be able to work as fast. You got to plan, but it will save you hard drive space, and it's with 2.8, it's going to be a lot easier to work that way with collections and things that they have coming into the software. So that won't be coming out till sometime middle of next year probably, but it'll be a lot easier to do than links in 2.79. Do you have a texture folder for every project or just one texture folder and you link to textures within the folder for each project? So I think I see what you're saying. I typically have like a resources folder on my main hard drive that has like, stock photos and then textures that are tileable textures, things like that I can reuse in different projects. Those would either be copied as local copies in another project file, and then reuse straight out of those directories. And I like to do that in case something happens and that file accidentally gets corrupted or whatever. I'm not accidentally screwing up my main resource folder. But again, that's preference. A lot of people link straight from the main dump that they have of all their resources into all of their files, and that's fine too. It saves hard drive space. These days, like if you have G Suite or Dropbox and you've got unlimited storage, do everything locally, back it all up online in the cloud, and then just delete it on your hard drive. And that's what I'm doing. And most studios that I know that I work with, everything's online. Like they have some local server storage for stuff that they need to edit with, like in the moment, because they edit with humongous files that are really, really big for film and stuff like that. But that's only so they can edit quickly with fast storage. And then as soon as they're done with the project, they back it up to the cloud. It gets erased from their hard drives that are, their current hard drives, and they move on. So that's kind of what I would say. Yeah, so hopefully that helps a little bit. I'm out of time for tonight, so I want to thank you guys again for taking the time to join me in the live streams. I do these every Friday night on this channel at 7 p.m. Central Time. I usually send out a reminder to my mailing list, so if you haven't checked it out, I want to kind of show you real quick what the Orange Guild is all about before I sign off here. So let me pull open a browser here and just kind of show you what the Orange Guild is all about. So if you go to theorangeguild.com, you can sign up for our mailing list. It's free. And basically, it's an online training academy for Blender artists. So we've got a couple of options here. If you jump into the training, you can see that we have a guild membership, and we have all of these separate courses, and these are growing fast. There's a lot more coming this year, and we're gonna have tons of next year. So let me log out of my account real fast so you guys can see what this looks like. But if you go to training or explore the training, you'll get a little explanation of like kind of what you get with this. If you are a hobbyist and you're not professional and you just want to kind of jump into the tutorials, take a look at the workshops we have, which are kind of bite-sized, kind of what you have tonight, that would be considered a workshop. Then we go over how to do things that are really helpful for you, but you're not really doing this professionally, so you don't need to spend a lot of money. So that's what the hobbyist membership is all about. All of the stuff that you see here currently is under the hobbyist membership, so that's all available to you guys as if you pay every month just $9. And then if you want to get into doing more professional based stuff, you can go into the membership and then take a look at professional membership here. It's higher price, $49 a month, but you get a lot more for that money. So if you are looking to get into the industry, or if you are already in the industry looking to keep yourself sharp and you're a Blender user, the professional membership isn't just Blender. We're going to get into some other programs like Substance and things like that along the way, but you get way more content with the professional membership. So as an example, that thing that I just showed you with the render of everything on the table that I was breaking down, the project I just showed you with the sword, the katana, all that stuff, those are really, really big projects, and they're just impossible to go over in a couple of hours. So because these bigger courses take months and months and months to produce, they only are available to professional members, or you can buy those individually. But the difference is that on top of the workshops, you get those courses, and you also get certifications. And certifications are a new feature coming next year, and basically those are going to allow you to display certifications that you've got from the guild that certify that you know a workflow, you understand a workflow. If you want to be into getting a job for games, and you want to be a game artist, and you want to get into the visual effects industry, having those that you can display on your LinkedIn, something like that, is really a way to kind of up your game and kind of demonstrate to the rest of people that are headhunting or recruiting that you know what you're doing, and it's just a way to emphasize your credibility. So all that stuff's great, and none of this is contract based. If you want to cancel, you can cancel anytime. We offer a 30-day money-back guarantee, so no risk. And also, if you sign up for the mailing list, you get the first month free. So that's on us, just to let you guys get a chance to get in here and hang out. The live streams from the past are all kind of in here. So if you've missed some of those, we've got a lot of live streams from my other channel that I brought in. that are here. We just started the live streams on the YouTube channel for the Orange Guild. Again, those are every Friday at 7 p.m. Right on the YouTube channel. If you become a member, we also have the Ask a Mentor section, which is really, really cool. I've got a lot of people in here starting to ask questions. So you can submit questions or you can submit your work to get critiqued, and I'll help you kind of learn how to level up your renders if you want to kind of check that out. But under the submit a question here, basically you log into your accounts, and then you can jump in here, ask me a question, and everybody's been just jumping in here and asking me how to do little things, you know, how to do little hacks, tips, whatever, for their projects, and I'm basically just going in here and breaking down with examples like whether it's topology or whatever you want to know about 3D stuff in Blender. That's what it's here for. So it's a great thing to have if you're sick of being online and having to mess with Facebook groups or Twitter or, you know, just unreliable answers and things like that. It's a great way to come in, get direct response from somebody who's a Blender Foundation certified trainer and knows what they're talking about, and you don't have to mess with amateurs. Okay, back into the chat. Is deep rigging animation covered in the Pro Pack? Not yet. I'm not an animator by trade, but I am more than willing to explore that as a topic, so I will mark down that you have requested that. A lot of what we have in the training right now deals with what you guys saw me do tonight in terms of rendering. So this is the old school Blender rendering engine. Then we get into here and we get into cycles and some modeling. This is subdivision surface modeling. I've got 2 courses just on modeling cars, concept cars for film. So this one's all about modeling. It's about 10 hours. This one is about 8 hours, or maybe not that long, maybe 4 hours or so for the shading part of it. But this is all cycles. And of course, we've got more stuff coming this year before the end of the year. So a lot of cool stuff. Again, that's all I'm going to say. Thank you guys so much for coming out tonight. I really appreciate your time. And I'll be back again next week at 7 p.m. So if you want to join me, make sure you mark that on your calendar, 7 p.m. Join the mailing list. I'll send out an announcement to let you know when it's coming. And happy blending, guys. I'll see you next week.